Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm back, it's me. I'm back with another reading video while watching Elder Scrolls. Today we're gonna read the intro to the condition of the working class in England. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Thank you very much. Alright. The history of the proletariat in England begins with the second half of the last century, with the invention of the steam engine and of machinery for working cotton. These inventions gave rise, as in well known, to an industrial revolution, a revolution which altered the whole civil society, one the historical importance of which is only now beginning to be recognized. England is the classic soil of this transformation, which was all the mightier the more silently it proceeded, and England is, therefore, the classic land of its chief product also, the proletariat. Only in England can the proletariat be studied in all its relations and from all sides. We have not, here and now, to deal with the history of this revolution, nor with its vast importance for the present and the future. Such the delineation must be reserved for a future, more comprehensive work. For the moment, we must limit ourselves to the little that is necessary for understanding the facts that follow, for comprehending the present state of the English proletariat. Before the industrial ignore that. Before the introduction of machinery, the spinning and weaving of raw materials was carried on in the working man's home. Wife and daughter spun the yarn that the father wove or that they sold if he did not work it up himself. These weaver families lived in the country in the neighborhood of the towns, and could get on fairly well with their wages, because their home market was almost the only one, and the crushing power of this competition that came later, with the conquest of foreign markets and the extension of trade, did not yet press upon wages. There was, further, a constant increase in the demand for the home market, keeping pace with the slower increase in population and employing all the workers, and there was also the impossibility of vigorous competition of the workers among themselves, conquest upon the rural dispersion of their homes, so it was that the weaver was usually in a position to lay by something and rent a little piece of land that he cultivated in his leisure hours, of which he had as many as he chose to take. Since he could weave whenever and as long as he pleased, true, he was a bad farmer and managed his land inefficiently, often obtaining but poor crops. Nevertheless, he was no proletarian. He had a stake in the country, he was permanently settled, and stood one step higher in society than the English workmen of today. So the workers vegetated through a possibly comfortable existence, leading a righteous and peaceful life in all piety and probity, and their material position was far better than that of their successors. They did not need to overwork. They did no more than they chose to do, and yet earned what they needed. They had leisure for healthful work in garden and or field, work which in itself was recreation for them, and they could take part besides in the recreations and games of their neighbors, and all these games, bowling, cricket, football, etc., contributed to their physical health and vigor. They were, for the most part, strong, well-built people in whose physique little or no difference from that of their peasant neighbors was discoverable. Their children grew up in the fresh country air, and if they could help their parents at work, it was only occasionally. While of 8 or 12 hours work for them, there was no question. What moral and intellectual character of this class was may be guessed. Shut off from the towns which they never entered, the yarn and woven stuff being delivered to traveling agents for payment of wages. So shut off that old people who lived quite in the neighborhood of the town never went thither until they were robbed of their trade by introduction of machinery and obliged to look about them in the towns for work. The weavers stood upon the moral and intellectual plane of the yeomen with whom they were usually immediately connected through their little holdings. They regarded their squire, the greatest landholder of the region, as their natural superior. They asked advice of him, laid their small disputes before him for settlement, and gave him all honor, as this patriarchal relation involved. They were respectable people, good husbands and fathers, led moral lives because they had no temptation to be immoral, there being no groggeries or low houses in their vicinity, and because the host at whose inn they now and then quenched their thirst was also a respectable man, usually a large tenant farmer who took pride in his good order, good beer in early hours. They had their children the whole day at home, and brought them up in obedience and the fear of God. The patriarchal relationship remained undisturbed so long as the children were unmarried. The young people grew up in an idyllic simplicity and intimacy with their playmates until they married, even though sexual intercourse before marriage almost unfailingly took place. This happened only when the moral obligation of marriage was recognized on both sides, and the subsequent wedding made everything good. In short, the English industrial workers of those days lived and thought after the fashion still to be found here and there in Germany, in retirement and seclusion, without mental activity and without violent fluctuations in their position of life. They could rarely read and far more rarely write, went regularly to church, never talked politics, never conspired, never thought, delighted in physical exercise, listened with inherited reverence when the Bible was read, and were, in their unquestionably humility, exceedingly well disposed towards their superior classes. But intellectually they were dead, lived only for their petty private interest, for their looms were dead, their looms and gardens, and knew nothing of the mighty movement which, beyond their horizon, was sweeping through mankind. They were comfortable in their silent vegetation, and for the Industrial Revolution they would never have emerged from this existence, which, cosily romantic as it was nevertheless not worthy of human beings. In truth, they were not human beings. They were merely toiling machines in the service of a few aristocrats who had guided history down to that time. The Industrial Revolution has simply carried this out to its logical end by making the workers machines pure and simple, taking from them the last trace of independent activity, and so forcing them to think and demand position worthy of men. As in France politics, so in England manufacture, and the movements of civil society in general drew into a well of history the last classes which had remained sunk in apathetic indifference to the universal interests of mankind. The first invention which gave rise to radical change in the state of English workers was the jenny, invented in the year 1764 by a weaver, James Hargreaves, of Standhill, near Blackburn, in North Lancashire. This machine was rough beginning of the later invented mule, and was moved by hand, instead of one spindle like the ordinary spinning wheel. It carried 16 or more, or 18 manipulated by a single workman. This invention made it possible to deliver more yarn than heretofore. Whereas the one weaver had employed 3 spinners, there had never been enough yarn, and the weaver had often been obligated to wait for it. There was now more yarn to be had than could be woven by the available workers. The demand for woven goods, already increasing, rose yet more in the consequence of cheapness of these goods, which cheapness in turn was the outcome of the diminished cost of producing yarn. More weavers were needed, and weavers' wages rose. Now that the weaver could earn more at his loom, he gradually abandoned his farming, and gave his whole time weaving. At that time, the family of 4 grown persons and 2 children, who were set to spooling, could earn, with 8 hours of daily work, £4 sterling in a week, and often, if trade was good and work pressed. It happened often enough that a single weaver earned £2 a week at his loom. By degrees, the class of farming weavers wholly disappeared, and merged into the newly rising class of weavers who lived wholly upon wages, had no property whatever, not even the pretended property of holding, and so became working men proletarians. Moreover, the old relation between spinner and weaver was destroyed, hitherto under one roof. Now that the jenny as well as the loom required a strong hand, men began to spin, and whole families lived by spinning, while others laid the antiquated supersted spinning wheel aside, and if they had not means of purchasing a jenny, were forced to live upon the wages of the father alone. Thus began with spinning and weaving that division of labor which has since been so infinitely perfected. While the industrial proletariat thus developing with the first, still very imperfect machine, the machine gave rise to the agricultural proletariat. There had hitherto been a vast number of small landowners, yeomen, who had vegetated in the same unthinking quiet as their neighbours, the farming weavers. They cultivated their scraps of land quite after the ancient and inefficient fashion of their ancestors, and opposed every change with the obstinacy peculiar to such creatures of habit. After remaining stationary from generation to generation, among them were many small holders also, not tenants in the present sense of the word, but people who had their land handed down from their fathers, either by hereditary or lease, or by force of ancient custom, and had hitherto held it securely as if it had actually been their own property. When the industrial workers withdrew from agriculture, a great number of small holdings fell idle, and upon these the new class of large tenants established themselves, tenants at will, holding 50, 100, 200 or more acres, liable to be turned out at the end of the year, but able to be improved tillage and larger farming to increase the yield of the land. They could sell their produce more cheaply than the yeoman, of whom nothing remained when his farm was no longer supported him but to sell it, procure a jenny or a loom, or take service as an agricultural labourer in the employ of the large farmer. His inherited slowness and inefficient methods of cultivation, bequeathed by his ancestors, and above which he could not rise, left him to no alternative when forced to compete with the men who managed their holdings on their sounder principles, and with all the advantages bestowed by farming on larger scale, and the investment of capital for the improvement of the soil. Meanwhile, the industrial movement did not stop here. Single capitalists began to set up spinning jennies in great buildings and to use water power for driving them, so placing themselves in a position to diminish the number of workers and sell their yarn more cheaply than single spinners do who move their own machines by hand. There were constant improvements in the jenny, so that the machines continually became antiquated and must be altered or even laid aside. And though the capitalists could not outbuy the application of water power even with the old machinery, for the single spinner this was impossible, and the factory system, the beginning of which thus made, received a fresh extension in 1767. Though the spinning throstle invented by Richard Arkwright, a barber in Preston in North Lancashire. After the steam engine, this was the most important mechanical invention of the 18th century. It was calculated from the beginning of the mechanical motive power and was based upon wholly new principles by the combination of peculiarities of the jenny and throstle. Samuel Crompton of Furwood, Lancashire, contrived the mule in 1785, and as Arkwright invented the carding engine and preparatory slubbing and revolving frames out of the same time, the factory system became the prevailing one for spinning of cotton. By the means of trifling modifications, these machines gradually adapted to the spinning of flax, and so to the suspending of hard work here too. But even then, the end was not yet. In the closing years of the last century, Dr. Cartwright, a country parson, had invented the power loom, and about 1804 had so far perfected it that it could successfully compete with the hand weaver, and this machinery was made doubly important by James Watt's steam engine, invented in 1764, and used for supplying motive power for spinning since 1785. With these inventions, since improved from year to year, the victory of machine work over hand work in the chief branches of English industry was won, and the history of the latter from that time forward simply relates to how the hand workers have been driven by machinery from one position after another. The consequences of this were, on one hand, a rapid fall in price of all manufactured commodities, prosperity of commerce and manufacture, the conquest of nearly all unprotected foreign markets, the sudden multiplication of capital and national wealth. On the other hand, a still more rapid multiplication of the proletariat, the destruction of all property holding and of all security of employment for the working class, demoralization, political excitement, and all those facts so highly repugnant to Englishmen in comfortable circumstances, which we shall have to consider in the following pages. Having since seen what a transformation in the social condition of the lower classes a single such clumsy machine as the jenny had wrought, there is no cause for surprise as that which a complete and interdependent system of finely adjusted machinery had brought about, machinery which receives raw material and turns out woven goods. Meanwhile, let us trace the development of the English manufacture somewhat more minutely, beginning with the cotton industry. In the years 1771 to 1775, there were annually imported to England rather less than 5 million pounds of raw cotton. In the year 1841, there was imported, holy shit, 528 million pounds. And the import for 1844 will reach at least 600 million pounds. In 1834, English exported 5,506 million yards of woven cotton goods, 6 67,005,000 pounds of cotton yarn and cotton hosiery of the value of 1,200,000 pounds. In the same year, over 8 million mule spindles were at work, 110,000 power, and 2,050 hand looms, throstle spindles not included. In the service of the cotton industry, and according to McCulloch's reckoning, nearly 1.5 million human beings were supported by this branch, of whom but 220,000 worked in the mills. The power used in these mills was steam, equivalently to 33,000 horsepower, and water equivalent to 11,000 horsepower. At the present, these figures are far more from adequate. It may be safely assumed that in the year 1845, the power and number of machines, the number of workers is greater by by 1/2 than it is in 1834. The chief centre of this industry is Lancashire, where it originated. It has thoroughly revolutionized this country, converting it from an obscure, ill-cultivated swamp into a busy, lively region, multiplying its population tenfold in 80 years, and causing giant cities such as Liverpool and Manchester, containing together 700,000 inhabitants, and their neighbouring towns, Bolton with 60,000, Rochdale with 75,000, Oldham with 50,000, Preston with 60,000, Ashton and Stolybridge with 40,000, and a whole list of other manufacturing towns to spring up as if it were a magic touch. The history of South Lancashire contains some of the greatest marvels of modern times, yet no one ever mentions them, and all these miracles are a product of the cotton industry. Glasgow, too, the centre of the cotton district of Scotland, for Lancashire and Renfrewshire, the cotton district has increased in population from 30,000 to 300,000 since introduction of the industry. The hosiery manufacture of Nottingham and Derby also received one fresh impulse from the lower price of yarn, and a second one from the improvement of the stocking loom, by means of which 2 stockings could be woven at once. The manufacture of lace, too, became an important branch of industry after the invention of the lace machine in 1777. Soon after that date, Lindley invented the point net machine, and in 1809, Heathcote invented the bobbin net machine, and in consequence of which, the production of lace was greatly simplified, and the demand increased proportionately in consequence of the diminished cost, so that now at least 200,000 persons are supported by this industry. Its chief centres are Nottingham, Leicester, and the west of England, Wiltshire, Devonshire, etc. A corresponding extension has taken place in the branches dependent upon the cotton industry, dyeing, bleaching, and printing. Bleaching by the application of chlorine in the place of the oxygen of the atmosphere, dyeing and printing by the rapid development of chemistry, and by printing by a series of most brilliant mechanical inventions, a yet greater advance which, with the extension of those branches caused by the growth of the cotton industry, raised them to a previously unknown great degree of prosperity. The same activity manifested itself in the manufacture of wool. Thus, this had hitherto been the leading department of the English industry, but the quantities formerly produced are as nothing in comparison with that which is now manufactured. In 1782, the whole wool crop of the preceding 3 years lay unused for want of workers, and would have continued so to lie if the newly invented machinery had not come to its assistance and spun it. The adaptation of this machinery to the spinning of wool was most successfully accomplished. Then began the same sudden development in the wool district, which we have already seen in the cotton districts. In 1738, there were 75,000 pieces of woolen cloth produced in the West Riding of Yorkshire. In 1817, there were 490,000 pieces, and the so rapid extension of the industry that pieces were produced then in 1820. In 1801, 101 million pounds of wool were worked up, and in 1835, 180 million pounds were worked up, of which 42 million pounds were imported. The principal centre of this industry is the West Riding of Yorkshire, where, especially at Bradford, long English wool is converted into worsted yarns, etc., while the other cities, Leeds, Halifax, Huddersfield, etc., short wool is converted into hard spun yarn and cloth. Then come the adjacent part of Lancashire, the region of Rochdale, where in addition to the cotton industry, much flannel is produced, and the west of England, which supplies the finest cloths, here also in the growth population worthy of observation. Then there's a graph. Well, not a graph, a table? Is that I don't know, bunch of fancy numbers that increase in number. A population which, since in 1831, must have increased at least 20 to 25% further. In 1835, the spinning of wool employed in the United Kingdom 1,313 mills, with 71,300 workers. These last being built but a small portion of the multitude who are supposed directly or the indirectly by the manufacture of wool, and excluding nearly all weavers. Jesus, I'm sorry. Progress in the linen trade developed later because the nature of the raw material made the application of spinning machinery very difficult. Attempts had been made in the last years of the last century in Scotland, but Frenchman Gerard, who introduced flax spinning in 1810, was the first who succeeded practically, and even Gerard's machines first attained on British soil the importance they deserved by means of improvements which they underwent in England and their universal application in Leeds, Dundee, and Belfast. From this time, the British linen trade rapidly extended. In 1814, 3,000 tons of flax were imported. In 1833, nearly 19,000 tons of flax and 3,400 tons of hemp. Ooh. The export of Irish linen to Great Britain rose from 32 million yards in 1800 to 53 million in 1825, of which a large part was re-exported. The export of English and Scotch woven linen goods rose from 25 million yards in 1820 to 51 million yards in 1833. The number of flax spinning establishments in 1835 was 347, employing 33,000 workers, of which one half were in the south of Scotland, more than 60 in the West Riding of Yorkshire, Leeds and its environs, 25 in Belfast, Ireland, and the rest in Dorset and Lancashire. Weaving is carried on in the south of Scotland, here and there in England, but principally in Ireland. With the success did the English turn their attention to the manufacture of silk. Raw material was imported from southern Europe and Asia, ready spun, and their chief labor lay in the twisting of fine threads. Until 1824, the heavy import duty, 4 shillings per pound on raw material, greatly retarded the development of the English silk industry, while only the markets of England and the colonies were protected for it. In that last year, the duty was reduced to 1 penny, and the number of mills at once largely increased. In a single year, the number of throwing spindles rose from 78,000 to 1,180,000. And although the commercial crisis of 1825 crippled this branch of industry for the moment, yet in 1827 more was produced than ever. The mechanical skill and the experience of the English having secured their twisting machinery the supremacy over the awkward devices of their competitors. In 1835, the British Empire possessed 263 twisting mills, employing 30,000 workers, located chiefly in Chestershire, and Macclesfield, Congleton, what the fuck is that word? And the surrounding districts, and in Manchester, the Somersetshire. Besides these, there are numerous mills for working up waste, from which a peculiar article known as spun silk is manufactured, with which the English supply even the Paris and the Lyons weavers. The weaving of silk so twisted and spun is carried on in Paisley and elsewhere in Scotland, and in Spitalfields, London, but also in Manchester and elsewhere. Nor is the gigantic advance achieved in the English manufacture since 1760 restricted to the production of clothing materials. The impulse, once given, was communicated to all branches of industrial activity, and a multitude of inventions wholly unrelated to those here cited received double importance from the fact that they were made in the midst of a universal movement. But as soon as the immeasurable importance of mechanical power was practically demonstrated, every energy was concentrated in the effort to exploit this power in all directions, and to exploit it in the interest of individual inventors and manufacturers, and the demand for machinery, fuel, and materials called the mass of workers and the number of trades into redoubled activity. The steam engine first gave importance to the broad coal fields of England. The production of machinery began now for the first time, and with it arose a new interest for iron mines which supplied the raw material for it. The increased consumption of wool stimulated the English sheep breeding, and the growing importation of wool, flax, and silk called forth an extension of the British Ocean carrying trade. Greatest of all was the growth of production of iron. The rich iron had always been smelted by means of charcoal, which became gradually more expensive as agriculture improved and forests were cut away. The beginning of the use of coke and iron smelting had been made in the last century. In 1780, a new method was invented of converting into available wrought iron coke smelted iron, which up to that time had been convertible into cast iron only. This process, known as puddling, consists of a withdrawal of the carbon which had mixed with the iron during the process of smelting, and opened a wholly new field for the production of English iron. Smelting furnaces were built 50 times larger than before. The process of smelting was simplified by the introduction of hot blasts, and iron could thus be produced so cheaply that a multitude of objects which had before been made of stone or wood were now made of iron. In 1788, Thomas Paine, the famous Democrat, built in Yorkshire the first iron bridge, which was followed by a great number of others, so that now nearly all bridges, especially for railroad traffic, are built of cast iron, while in London itself a bridge across the Thames, a Southwark Bridge, has been built of its material, iron pillars, support for machinery, etc. The used, and since the introduction of gas lighting and railroads, new outlets for English iron products are opened. Nails and screws gradually became to be made by machinery. Huntsman and Sheffielder discovered in 1790 a method of casting steel by which labor was saved, and the production of wholly new cheap goods rendered practicable. And through the greater purity of the material placed at its disposal, and the more perfect tools, new machinery, and minute division of labor, the metal trade of England now first attained importance. The population of Birmingham grew from 73,000 in 1801 to 200,000 in 1844. That of the Sheffield from 46,000 in 1801 to 110,000 in 1844. And the consumption of coal in the latter city alone reached in 1834 515,000 tons. In 1805, there were exported 4,300 tons of iron products and 4,600 tons of pig iron. In 1834, 16,200 tons of iron products and 107,000 tons of pig iron, while the whole iron product reaching in 1740, but 17,000 tons, had risen in 1834 to nearly 700 tons. The smelting of pig iron alone consumes yearly more than 300 million tons of coal, and the importance of which coal mining has attained in the course of the last 60 years can scarcely be conceived. All the English and Scotch deposits are now worked. All the mines of Northumberland and Durham alone yield annually more than 5 million tons for shipping and employ 40 to 50,000 men. According to the Durham Chronicle, there were worked in these two countries in 1753, 14 mines in 1800, 40 mines in 1834, 76 mines in 1843, 130 mines. Moreover, all mines are now much more energetically worked than formerly. A similarly increased activity was applied to the working of tin, copper, and lead, and alongside of the extension of glass manufacture arose a new branch of industry in the production of pottery, rendered important by the efforts of Josiah Wedgwood about 1763. This inventor placed the whole manufacture of stoneware on a scientific basis, introduced better taste and form, founded the potteries of northern Staffordshire, holy shit, a district of 8 English miles square, which formerly a desert waste, is now sown with works and dwellings and supports more than 60,000 people. How much more do we have? Okay. Into the universal well of activity, everything was drawn. Agriculture made corresponding advance. Not only did landing property pass, as we have already seen, into the hands of the new owners and cultivators, agriculture was effected in still another way. The great holders applied capital into the improvement of the soil, tore down needless fences, drained, manured, employed better tools, and applied a rotation of crops. The progress of science came to their assistance also. Sir Humphrey Davy applied chemistry to the agriculture with success, and the development of mechanical science bestowed a multitude of advances upon the large farmer. Further, in consequence of the increase of population, the demand for agriculture products increased in such measure from that of 1760 to 1835, 6,840,540 acres of waste land were reclaimed, and in spite of this, England was transformed from a grain exporting to a grain importing country. The same activity was developed in the establishment of communication. From 1818 to 1829, there were built England and Wales 1,000 English miles of roadway of width prescribed by law 60 feet, and nearly all the old roads were reconstructed on the new system of macadam. In Scotland, the Department of Public Works built since 1803 nearly 900 miles of roadway and more than 1,000 bridges, by which the population of the Highlands was suddenly placed within reach of civilization. The Highlanders had hitherto been chiefly poachers and smugglers. They now became farmers and hard workers, and though Gaelic schools were organized for the purpose of maintaining the Gaelic language, yet Gaelic Celtic customs and speech are rapidly vanishing before the approach of English civilization. So too in Ireland, between the countries of Cork, Limerick, and Kerry, lay hitherto a wilderness wholly without passable roads and serving by reasons of its inaccessibility as the refuge of all criminals and the chief protection of the Celtic Irish nationality in the south of Ireland. It is now being cut through by public roads, and civilization has thus gained admission even to this savage region. The whole British Empire, and especially England, which 60 years ago had as bad roads as Germany or France then had, is now covered in a network of the finest roadways, and these too, like almost everything else in England, are the work of the private enterprise, the state having done very little in this direction. Before 1755, England possessed almost no canals. In that year, a canal was built in Lancashire from Stanky Brook to St. Helens, and in 1759, James Brindley built the first important one, the Duke of Bridgewater's Canal from Manchester, and the coal mines of the district to the mouth of the Mersey passing near Bolton by aqueduct over the River Irwell. From this achievement dates the canal building of England, to which Brindley first gave importance. Canals are now built and rivers made navigable in all directions. In England alone, there are 2,200 miles of canals and 1,800 miles of navigable river. In Scotland, the Caledonian Canal was cut directly across the country, and in Ireland several canals were built. These improvements too, like the railroads and the roadways, are nearly all the work of private individuals and companies. The railroads have been only recently built. The first great one was opened in Liverpool to Manchester in 1830, while which in all the great cities have been connected by rail. London with Southampton, Brighton, Dover, Colchester, Exeter, and Birmingham with Gloucester, Liverpool, Lancaster, also with Leeds with Hull and Newcastle. There are also many minor lines building or projected, which will soon make it possible to travel from Edinburgh to London in one day. As it had transformed the means of communication by land, so did the introduction of steam revolutionized travel by sea. The first steamboat was launched in 1807 on the Hudson in North America, the first in the British Empire. In 1811, on the Clyde. Since then, more than 600 have been built in England, and in 1836, more than 500 were plying to and from British ports. Such, in brief, is the history of the English industrial development in the past 60 years, a history which has no counterpart in the annals of humanity. 80 years ago, England was a country like every other, with small towns, few and simple industries, and a thin but proportionally large agricultural population. Today, it is a country like no other, with a capital of 2.5 million inhabitants, with vast manufacturing cities, with an industry that supplies the world and produces almost everything by means of the most complex machinery, with an industrious, intelligent, dense population of which 2/3 are employed in trade and commerce. They're composed of class wholly different, forming in fact, with the other customs and other needs, a different nation from the England of those days. The Industrial Revolution is of the same importance for England as the political revolution for France and the philosophical revolution for Germany. And the difference between England in 1760 and in 1844 is at least as great as that between France under the something regime and during the Revolution of July. But the mightiest result of this industrial transformation is the English proletariat. We have already seen how the proletariat was called into existence by the introduction of machinery. The rapid extension of manufacture demanded hands, wages rose, and troops of workmen migrated from the agricultural districts to the towns. Population multiplied enormously, and nearly all the increase took place in the proletariat. Further, Ireland has entered upon an orderly development only since the beginning of the 18th century. There too, the population, more than decimated by English cruelty and earlier disturbances, now rapidly multiplied, especially after the advance in manufacture began to draw masses of Irishmen towards England. Thus arose the great manufacturing and commercial cities of the British Empire, in which at least 3/4 of the population belonged to the working class, while the lower middle class consists only of small shopkeepers and very, very few handicraftsmen. For though the rising manufacture first attained importance by transforming tools into machines, workrooms into factories, and consequently the toiling lower middle class into the toiling proletariat, and the former large merchants into the manufacturers, though the lower middle class was thus early crushed out, and the population reduced to the two opposing elements, workers and capitalists, this happened outside of the domain of manufacture proper, in the province of handicraft and retail trade as well. In the place of the former masters and apprentices came great capitalists and working men who had no prospect of rising above their class. Handwork was carried on after the fashion of factory work. The division of labor was strictly applied, and small employers who could not compete with the great establishments were forced down into the proletariat. At the same time, the destruction of the former organization of hard work, handwork, and the disappearance of the lower middle class deprived the working man of all possibility of rising into the middle class himself. Hitherto, he had always had the prospect of establishing himself somewhere as a master artificer, perhaps employing German journeymen and apprentices. But now, when master artificers were crowded out by manufacturers, where large capital had become necessary for carrying on work independently, the working class became, for the first time, an integral, permanent class of the population, whereas had formerly often been merely a transition leading to the bourgeoisie. Now he who was born to toil had no other prospect than that of remaining a toiler all his life. Now, for the first time, therefore, the proletariat was in a position to undertake an independent movement. In this way were brought together those vast masses of working men who now fill the whole British Empire, whose social condition forces itself every day more and more upon the attention of the civilized world. The condition of the working class is the condition of the vast majority of English people. The question, what is it to become of those destitute millions who consume daily what they earned yesterday, who have created the greatness of England by their inventions and their toil, who become with every passing day more conscious of their might, and demand with daily increasing urgency their share of advantages of society? This, since the Reform Bill, has become the national question. All parliamentary debates of any importance may be reduced to this, and though the English middle class will not as yet admit it, though they try to evade this great question and to represent their own particular interests as the truly national ones, their action is utterly useless. With every session of Parliament, the working class gains ground, the interests of the middle class diminish in importance, and in spite of the fact that the middle class is the chief, in fact the only power in Parliament, the last session of 1844 was a continuous debate upon subjects affecting the working class, the Poor Relief Bill, the Factory Act, and the Masters and Servants Act, and Thomas Duncombe, the representative of the working men in the House of Commons, was the great man of this session, while the liberal middle class, with this motion of repealing the Corn Laws, and the radical middle class, with its resolution of refusing the taxes, played pitiable roles. Even the debates about Ireland were at the bottom debates about the Irish proletariat and the means of coming to its assistance. It is high time, too, for the English middle class to make some concessions to the working men who no longer plead but threaten, for in a short time it may be too late. In spite of all this, the English middle class, especially the manufacturing class, which is enriched directly by means of the poverty of the workers, persists in ignoring this poverty. This class, feeling itself the mighty representative class of the nation, is ashamed to lay the sore spot of English bare before the eyes of the world, will not confess even to itself that the workers are in distress, because it, the property-holding manufacturing class, must bear the moral responsibility for this distress. Hence the scornful smile which intelligent Englishmen assume when anyone begins to speak the condition of the working class. Hence the utter ignorance on the part of the whole middle class of everything which concerns the workers. Hence the ridiculous blunders which men of this class in out of Parliament make when the position of the proletariat comes under discussion. Hence the absurd freedom from anxiety with which the middle class dwells upon a soil that is honeycombed and may any day collapse, the speedy collapse of which as certain as the mathematical or mechanical demonstration. Hence the miracle that the English have yet no single book upon the condition of their workers, although they have been examining and mending the old state of things no one knows how many years. Hence also the deep wrath of the whole working class, from Glasgow to London, against the rich, by whom they are systematically plundered and mercilessly left to their fate, a wrath which before too long a time goes by, a time almost within the power of man to predict, must break out into a revolution in comparison with which the French Revolution and the year 1794 will prove to have been child's play. Alright, so that's it. I'm sorry for messing it up a lot. Basically, what that went over was the Industrial Revolution made hand workers into machine workers, which created the proletariat, and thus created this whole class, huge class divide, and a lot of uproar in England because the majority working class was being used, if you get that. So yeah, next episode we will be reading the next part, the industrial proletariat. So look forward to that. I'll catch you later. Subscribe.